All right, hello everybody. So another week of lessons here at the Arts Council, and as always, my name is Shelby. Today we are going to be drawing a realistic eye, and I've already kind of got some of it blocked out just so we have enough time to get to everything. I want to make sure you get all the directions. Okay, so first of all, like the biggest thing with this is that you're going to want to make sure that you're looking at the shape of the eye and not drawing what you think an eye should look like. So you're not drawing a football, you're really drawing like the tear duct and that top lid and then the bottom lid together. So this is what I've got to start with. So that outline there, and I've got the tear duct blocked off. And then the next thing I drew in was the iris here, so the colored part of the eye. And the biggest thing with that there is that we need to remember that the eyelid covers the iris. It's not completely round in the middle of the eye, because when that happens, it's because we look really surprised and our eyes are open big and wide. And then also, like kind of that last step of drawing the outline there to get some guides in is drawing this big kind of shadow, and that ends up being right here. And that's where like your skull, where your eye socket kind of starts, and kind of it's just like skin in your eyeball under there. And so that ends up being like a pretty important shadow. And then this bottom lash line there. So I'm going to jump right into kind of like drawing in the pupil, which is in the center of that iris there. And you want it to be the darkest thing that you draw. You don't want it to be any lighter, because like lighter, and it's going to look just like kind of odd. Like it doesn't look how it's supposed to look. So you're going to make sure that we get in a big, dark pupil. And that's the black part of the eye. And then the next thing is drawing in the shadow, or not the shadow, the highlight in this eye right here. So this just means that the sun is shining and that our eyes are kind of liquid. Like they're not liquid, but they're wet. They're wet and they're shiny, and so that spot happens. So I'm going to draw that in here too, and we're not going to touch it. We're not going to touch that spot because it needs to stay bright white for things to look realistic. And so the next thing is kind of outlining the iris. We're really kind of starting in on the shading here. And I'm just using like essentially like a school pencil. It's an HB weight if you're interested in that. And I wouldn't use a mechanical pencil, but you can use just like a regular school pencil. And I'm just outlining the iris there, and I'm shading it in just like a mid kind of black, like gray tone, like not anything super special, not super light, not super dark, just really kind of right in the middle. And I'll show you that when I get that in. So that's what we got going so far. So the next step for sure is adding in kind of that texture in the eyeball. So as you notice in a lot of eyeballs, they kind of look like maybe like there's some folding in there, things like that. We want to really add in kind of a texture there. We don't want them to just be flat and like one tone. And so we got that going. And I'll show you after I'm going to show you then too that we want to draw in the shadow that the top eyelid casts on the eyeball. So I'm using that top eye line that we drew, and I'm just kind of outlining it pretty dark where the lashes would go on the top, because like our eyeball is in our eyelid. It's inside the lashes and the eyelid. So I drew in there, and then I got in some texture in that iris there. So that's what we got going with this step. And if you're at home and you're doing this with me, please feel free to pause and kind of like restart as needed, because I am going pretty fast, but I want to make sure that we get everything covered and so you have all the instructions. So we got that shadow, and we're really just going to pull it down and kind of lighten it up. So it's going to go from light, and you need it to go to like a pretty light gray. And when you're doing the shadow, you want to make sure that you pull it down and like around kind of that the little like tear duct, and it looks round. And like same with over here. So I'm adding in the shadow kind of that goes that way, and then I'm going to add another one that goes around that way, so that it looks like there's a round eyeball inside kind of those eyelids. So got that, and we're going to soften it up kind of as we go down, because we don't want any like super hard lines. And I'm going to add in a little bit of variation as far as depth with that iris too. So the iris is the colored part of the eye. Again, I don't want you to not know what I'm talking about. And it's not really all just one grade. There is some shadows and some variation in the blue in there. And so I just want to kind of add a little bit of something so that it doesn't just look all the same. And I'll show you that. So that's what we got going with that. And then next we're going to really tackle those eyelids. And so the eyelids, you want to start with that guideline that we drew of kind of where your eye socket starts on your eyelid. And you really want it to be pretty dark. You want it to be about as dark as the shadow is like underneath your eyelid in the eyeball. and you're gonna pull down that shadow almost to the eyeball itself. You want it to be pretty dark, and then you want to slowly go to gray. And I would suggest kind of starting pretty light and like gradually getting darker. You can always get darker. It's a little bit tougher to get lighter again. So just keep adding and adding and adding to those shadows until they're kind of where you're at, and then you don't really have to do any erasing. And I'll show you this first half of the shadow on like the top kind of inside of the eye, and then I'll show you kind of what we do next to make that look three-dimensional. So you got this in, and then I'm gonna leave a pretty big highlight right there, and I'm gonna bring back in some shadow back over here on the eye, so that'll be right there. And so I'm gonna leave the highlight so that it looks kind of like that's where the light is shining. It makes it look like it's kind of puffed up around the eye instead of just like laying flat over top of it. We want it to look like it's coming off the page, or that we could like almost touch it really. And this shadow is a little funky right now. My pencil's being weird too. Okay, so that's what we got going for that second part of the eyelid, and I'm gonna do really the same underneath there. We're gonna do the same, and I want this highlight to match down here too. That's a big part of it, because if they don't match, it doesn't look like it's supposed to be there. They look kind of out of place and kind of wonky. So I'm just gonna continue on. I'm gonna outline that bottom shadow of the eye, and again, we're gonna bring up then the shadow if we're using the same kind of analogy. And it's not as drastic. There's not as much of a shadow underneath. They're a little skinnier, a little bit more, less pronounced, I should say. And just kind of adding in just a little depth, maybe. And I will include my final picture too after I do a little bit of work after the video ends, but I really want to make sure that the majority of this week is spent kind of listening to me talk. And I know it's a little switched up a little bit from last week and previous weeks, just because I didn't want you to get bored with just doing projects all the time if you were really kind of wanting to know how to draw, because drawing can be a little tricky. There's some tips and tricks in there that just are, you gotta almost hear from somebody. You can't really look them up on your own. So that's what we got going with that shadow underneath then. So we got that highlight, and then the shadow on each side, just to give a little depth and some eyelids to the eyeball. And then so the last step here is I'm going to show you how to do some eyelashes. And so eyelashes are tricky. You're going to want to use the same pencil. You don't want to use anything like super soft, because they crumble and they don't hold the line right. And it's a lot about pressure. So you want to start pretty hard and let off. So this is kind of a check mark right now, but you see it's like pretty dark, and then it kind of tapers off. That's what you want with those eyelashes. And you do kind of want them to be this shape because they are coming from underneath. So they aren't straight sticks. They are curved, like in this picture here. They are kind of curved underneath and come out. So I'm going to do a couple. I'm going to start at the very kind of end, like the opposite end, so it would be like over here on the corner. And I'm going to do some like pretty long ones to begin, just because they do look longer on the end over there, because like that's the way that like the picture is taken. It's the direction. These aren't actually shorter, but they look shorter because it's called foreshortened, because they're kind of standing up straight towards us instead of out. And I think another thing to mention with eyelashes is that a lot of time, like, less is more. Like, people want to add like a bunch of eyelashes and like go almost overboard with them sometimes. And I think like in the grand scheme, like you can get away with like really not having a bunch at all, just a couple to give the illusion that they're there. So that's what we got for eyelashes. So not a ton, not even as many as in the picture, but just enough so that it looks like you got something going. So that's what I got for the eye drawing. Again, I'll post my image and the reference image as well if you want to look at that one. And then I'd love to see what you produce. So tag us on Facebook, email us, let us know. But other than that, I'll see you next week. So have an awesome week and can't wait.